Hey everybody. So we're gonna look at chapter 28 here. Um, what are we gonna look at? This chapter really focuses on the 8 years, like an 8-year period, 64 to 72. Have you noticed, we've really gotten, as we go along, we get smaller and smaller because we get closer to modern times and a lot more things happen in a much smaller time period. This may be very contentious. Well, it is a very contentious time period in modern history, where liberalism and conservatism are really at odds with each other. At Washington on television, really for the first time for the world to see. We also see large reform measures. We see a significant increase in the welfare state during this time period as well. Probably the largest increase in federal authority in the United States since FDR, 30 years earlier. So we will go ahead and get right into this. Legacy of Kennedy's presidency, it really sort of embodied the expectations and the inspirations of many Americans in the 60s. It was about a young and passionate leader asking Americans, you've all heard it, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And his idea was that Americans could improve their own country through your own actions. You could improve this nation that we live in. However, he's then assassinated. He's assassinated in November of 63 in Dallas. The Kennedy mystique is what it's called, which really develops after Kennedy passes. He had a very youthful image, of course. He was young. He was our youngest president, I believe. The assassination, of course, a tragic sense of loss that everybody felt. And everybody's standing there looking at Jacqueline Kennedy and their two young children, and we had this image that was portrayed to the public. The reality was his image was created. It was a manufactured image, as all are. I mean, there's nothing unusual about this. It's just most presidents are not glorified the same way Kennedy was, as sort of a shining white knight who was going to save America. Um, the reality was his image wasn't perfect at all. He was a drug abuser, not illegal necessarily, but he was taking like 11 different medications. He was a womanizer. We know he slept with other women in the White House. Um, so he was flawed like every other president. Most presidents have probably done things like this. The difference is we know so much more about him due to our modern media and investigative reporting that we never really had before the 60s and the 70s. This real in-depth, uh, sort of this cult of personality on Kennedy and of who he was. It was all about him and the image, not really even what he represent, not even really what he was as president. And then he dies. He's killed, and a lot of people just are at a loss. Um, I remember my parents talking about this. And I remember my mother telling me she thought it was the end of the world. I mean, it was just everything. It was the end of everything. So much all wrapped up in one single guy who is flawed just like the rest of us, just a regular guy. So, yeah, interesting. He passes. LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, takes over, the vice president, Democrat. He takes over. He invokes the idea of his image. Again, every president has an image. His image is the what we call the Great Society. LBJ. This is his version of the New Deal. His version. Every Democratic president since FDR has tried to create some sort of version of their New Deal to bring social welfare and social justice to the bottom half of America's population, the ones who are the least affected, the least assisted, the ones who are most impoverished, and the ones who are in most need. His great society should bring abundance, prosperity, liberty for all Americans. That's the goal. That's the hope of it. He wants to end poverty. He calls it a war on poverty. He has every intent of ending poverty, which unfortunately doesn't happen. And he also is maybe our very first president who has so spoken out about racial justice. No other president probably has ever really spoken out this much about racial justice, or really, I suppose, more specifically, racial injustice, about how our entire system is really prejudiced against people of color and minorities. Um, he believes all this change has to come about. He believes it must. He is probably more aggressive. liberal and than John F. Kennedy was. Um, he immediately pushed to get the Civil Rights Act passed, which I said before. Kennedy promises it. He dies, killed, and then LBJ gets it done immediately, gets the Civil Rights Pass signed. He wanted to show, he believed this was his legacy. LBJ believed his legacy would be his actions towards civil rights. Um, he truly believed that, that's what he'd be remembered for, was his actions on civil rights. Uh, he also gets the Economic Opportunity Act passed of 1964. Um, remember that book we talked about? Oh my goodness, back in chapter 25, I think, called The Other America. And that Other America, that book we mentioned talked about how one fifth of Americans probably lived in poverty or did live in poverty. Well, LBJ made this his priority to end poverty in America. And the Economic Opportunity Act is passed in 64, passed through Congress. Specifically addresses the issues of poor and includes all kinds of programs, which are all programs which were incredibly beneficial. Many of these still exist. This is just a couple. Head Start program, Job Corps, Upward Bound, community action programs. Um, Head Start is free nursery schools for poor kids. Job Corps is still around. Upward Bound, which was job training and employment for young people, the youth, job training and employment for younger people, especially focusing on minorities. Many of these programs specifically focus on minority neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods, white or black, doesn't matter. Community Action Program encouraged the poor to be vocal in their needs to the city and the government, basically to get the people to speak up. This is sort of a grassroots progressive movement, the Community Action Program, to get the people in the local poor communities to speak up, speak to their government, speak to local politicians, encourage the poor to vote. The idea being to encourage poor people to vote, that gives them the greatest voice. They can vote people into office because half of America is lower economic status. We're not saying poor necessarily, but half of Americans are below middle class, what we typically would think is below middle class. So, with that being stated, if everyone votes, you pretty much would run the country. I say the same thing to students in every class. If all of you would just get out and vote, you would decide everything. If the 20 and 30-year-olds would just get out there and vote 100%, you would run this country. You would elect every politician. You would decide every single person in Washington because I mean, but you don't. So, and that's really what this is about. It's really to inspire the community to get out and vote. So you can actually, you want the laws changed? You want more laws that help students or help minorities or help the poor? Then you got to vote those politicians into office, and you can do that if you stand up and do it. But you got to stand up and do it. Um, These programs are very unpopular, especially in the southern state. Now, let me say it differently. Make sure I correct that. These programs were very unpopular in the southern states, where the southern states was primarily minority and poor. Vast majority of the population in the southern states would have been the slave states. That the southeast were mostly poor and minorities. Again, some southern states had 50% black population. Um, this is one of the reasons the Democratic Party loses the South. Today, the southern states are almost all what we call red states. They vote Republican. Before the 1960s, the southern states were mostly voting Democrat. Or even you go all the way back to like the 30s and they all voted Democrat. By the 60s, it was starting to change. But a lot of things LBJ does, he's actually one of the reasons his programs, which are good programs, is one of the things that sort of leads us. It's a step in the process of turning the South Republican because so many of these programs are specifically targeting poor minorities, and that was very unpopular for the white politicians in the South. So many of them abandoned the Democratic Party and became Republican, believing the Republican Party more represented them versus the Democrat, which generally represented the working and the poor and minorities and immigrants. Uh, Very interesting. So in the 64 election, he runs for a president in a 64 election. He really sees himself as the newest version of FDR. He ran against the Republican Barry Goldwater. Um, Whew, I had to sneeze there. I had to take a break there for a moment. Barry Goldwater was ultra conservative. He campaigned against the Civil Rights Act. He did not want the Civil Rights Act. What did the Civil Rights Act do of 64? Well, just three things it did. It ended discrimination against minorities. It ended segregation, Jim Crow segregation, and it gave voting rights to minorities and blacks. Well, definitely should run against that. Um, uh, so that's what Goldwater was running against. LBJ ran on a landslide. He won a landslide victory. Many people saw him as the next, obviously, the next John F. Kennedy. Plus, a lot of these programs he did actually did increase voting participation among the poor. And guess what? They elected LBJ. Again, facts are facts. If students and minorities and young people and poor and all got together, you would run this country. You could turn white. You could turn the White House black. Suddenly, minorities and people of color would run Washington. But you know, this doesn't happen. Doesn't happen for a variety of reasons. It isn't all to blame on youth and minorities. A lot of it is actually blame on disenfranchisement measures from more conservative leaning areas. That also is a reality too. He ran on this platform of civil rights, his great society, and the idea that he was fulfilling Kennedy's promise. And he wins quite well. The Great Society initiatives included several things. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 65, which gave $1 billion, which was still a lot of money back then, in federal funds to teacher training, $1 billion for teacher training and education programs. What about Medicare, Medicaid, HUD, public housing? Oh my gosh. Yeah, the kind of stuff he does here is amazing, the kind of programs he creates. There's a response to this, though. There's a very strong conservative backlash to all these programs, um, which we will talk about. Medicaid, which is health care for the poor here in California, usually called Medi-Cal. This was all passed in 65. Medicare, of course, was health care and funds for the elderly. Incredibly popular. Almost all elderly people in America use Medicare in some way. So these programs are incredibly significant. He expanded environmental programs. He created the HUD, Housing Urban Development, pushed for hundreds of thousands of new public housing units. He oversaw the creation of dozens of new departments and organizations in Washington to assist average Americans, from health programs to art programs to art programs in schools. In many ways, LBJ is maybe probably our most liberal president we've ever had. If you really look at stuff that FDR did, LBJ took everything FDR did and went even further. Well, how did it do? Yeah, that's a little more of a question. Very mixed results, actually. Don't get me wrong, good results. I guess the mixed results is this: good results, but you're here and you set the bar here and you hit in the middle. That still is huge, but the bar here is never reached. Improve, but never reach this. And then another aspect of this is the counter attack, the counter insurgency that happens from the conservative side. So let's see. Poverty changes dramatically. We believe poverty level drops almost in half, from about 20% to about 13. Number of Americans living in poverty. That is a huge drop. I don't even do the math on that, but that's millions. That's millions of people. So he takes millions of people, maybe 10 million people or more, takes them out of poverty and puts them above the poverty line. Huge improvement. Huge improvement. Removing poverty and hopelessness from many, many millions of people, especially children. Improves the quality of life and care for elderly. I mean, Medicare alone. Medicare alone is one of the greatest programs ever created by the government, created under him. Health care for the elderly, thought to specifically have there's many professionals, or many I don't know what you want to call it, whoever does the research on this, that says Medicare alone might have increased the life expectancy of the average American by almost 5 years. Huge. I mean, that really certainly helps. Medicaid, of course, for young kids and children and single mothers, it really incredibly help. We also see an increased racial diversity in politics and in society. We see lessening of black poverty by half. African American poverty is cut in half across the country. However, the problems are still there. Don't get me wrong; it doesn't like to solve everything. We still have segregation in the 60s and 70s. It's still a reality. Even though it's pretty much illegal now, we still have it. Segregation, discrimination. You still have that 13%. Even you cut it from 20 to 13, you still have 13% of Americans. That's how many? 10, 15 million Americans living in poverty? We are the richest, in this period of time, we are the wealthiest nation on earth. Wealthiest nation on earth. And we have 10, 15 million people living in poverty. It makes no sense. It really doesn't. Very little help from programs, and of course, we still have racial strife all across America. Millions are helped, millions are still living in with a lot of problems. So, set the bar up here. He made it halfway. Huge improvement. Really was significant. Strong victory, and there you go. There you start to see it. You start to see the Republican Party starting to move into the southern states. LBJ won most of the country. We've only had a handful of presidents ever get over 60% of the popular vote. That's a threshold that only a few presidents have ever achieved. Big deal right there. Wins most of the majority, about 2/3, almost 2/3 of the American vote, which is huge. But we can really start to see the change happening as the years go on. This right here gets bigger and bigger. This Republican South, and today, again, most of these states go Republican today. Most of this goes Republican. So it certainly changes over the years. He won all but 6 states. Poverty rate. Poverty rate continues to decline. You go from 1959, it's almost 25%. Down, down, up 15, steady there, all the way down to well, this is who's elected 2000? That's George Bush, right? So all the way up to about the time of or the end of Clinton, I guess would be the appropriate here. So this is where we have Kennedy take office through here. LBJ is elected right here. This is LBJ's presidency all the way down to about here. Then we have Nixon, who will win in 68. And the poverty actually continues to drop all the way through Nixon's presidency. Poverty level continues to drop all the way through Nixon's presidency. He was a popular elected president. He won 2 terms. He was popular. He really was. And then we hit the depression of the 70s. We hit a depression in 73, 74, and then of course poverty goes up dramatically. And then poverty skyrockets here under oh wow, totally blanked. The peanut farmer. Damn, what's his name? Oh my goodness. Anyway, our president from 76, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, our president from 76 to 80. And I sympathize. I sympathize isn't the right word. I associate. Hell isn't the right word either. Whatever. Who cares what the word is? My dad was a peanut farmer. So my dad was a peanut farmer, and so Jimmy Carter, I believe, was a peanut farmer as well. It's interesting. Anyway, and then we have Reagan's presidency here. So we have a high spike in poverty in Reagan's first couple of years. Not necessarily blamed on him. The reality is, in most cases, whatever economic issues happen in the first couple of years of a president's term, usually you can blame that on the previous president. Because it takes 2 or 3 years for economic changes to really work through the economy. So this spike in the first couple of years of Reagan's presidency probably is due to Carter in the 70s. Probably can't be blamed on him. And then actually the last couple of years of Reagan's presidency, we see it go down. Then we get to George Bush #1, continues to go down. Then we get up here this big spike at the end of George Bush's term, so we could probably blame that on Bush and Reagan. Then all the way through the 90s, we see it drop dramatically underneath Bill Clinton. Interesting. But the rate continues, and right here it is. So by the year 2000, we've achieved a poverty rate of about 10%. Really, all this is inexcusable. All of it. Wealthiest nation on earth. And we have millions, tens of millions of people living in poverty. WTF? It really makes no sense. All right, women's movement. Women's rights movement really is reborn in this period. And again, the backlash to it. All these things have incredible conservative backlash. It really is. There's actually a TV show just came on that actually can reference into this. That actually just came on television recently. I'm not going to say what it is, doesn't matter. But yeah, it's interesting. Inspired by the civil rights movement, new laws benefiting women, we see feminism really come to life in the 60s. Working women who belonged to unions were usually referred to as labor feminists. If you were a working woman in a union, which was a small percentage, you were a labor feminist. They were a small number, but they often fought for workplace equality, things like maternity leave, equal pay, which was still in like the 60s, 60, 70% of what a man made. By 1970, 40% of all women worked outside the home. Almost half of all women worked outside the home by the 1970s. Female work continued to be undervalued. Often didn't give credit for it. The credit still went to the husband, who was the breadwinner. This was sort of the American image. The man earning all the money and being the breadwinner. Even the reality is, women were significant contributors. Very often, to achieve a middle class lifestyle required a woman's contribution. Not just taking care of the kids, which that's a job you don't get paid for, taking care of the home and kids, but of course, actually having work outside the home. And of course, still making 60, 70% of what a man made doing the same work. Also, part time women much likely to work part time, which were likely to be service industries, and much more challenging to get into colleges, universities. Not basic programs, but the advanced programs, doctor and lawyer and things like that. Really difficult to get into a lot of those programs. We believe there was a lot of discrimination that went against women getting into advanced degree programs, even though the majority of college students are women. By the 1960s and 70s, like 55% of college students are women at the regular level, but at the advanced degree, almost entirely men. Like 85% of advanced degrees are men. Um, so Betty Friedan's A Feminine Mystique. We talked about it before. This sort of targeted the 19, this basically, so 63, The Feminine Mystique. It really targeted white middle class college educated women who felt stifled by marriage um, and the whole ideal of the domestic housewife. We talked about that before. Many of them said this whole feminine ideal, this feminine mystique was bullshit, of course, and we talked about it. Women often actually did work. They definitely contributed, even though society's telling them they probably shouldn't work. They should be home barefoot and pregnant. I mean, I don't know where that term came from, but that's what it's saying. Society is saying you should be a domestic housewife, while many women want to work, or in reality, many women do work. They're just not given credit for it. They're undervalued, not given credit. And she, of course, fights against this whole feminine mystique. She said her books basically say women, it's okay. It's okay to go out and do this. It's okay to have work, to have jobs. Um, it was okay to need more than simply having a better fridge and more kids. You could have a career. You could have a job. You could have it all if you wanted. That you should be valued and you should go to college. Um, Women should be treated fully equal to men. There's a lot of pushback to this. There is a lot of pushback to this. Um, we do, as I said, female college students skyrocket. We actually see 50 by the 1970s, about 50%, 55% of all college students are women. Yet advanced degrees are handed out vast majority to men only. We believe discrimination in college acceptance at the graduate program was one of the reasons for that. Um, Government report in 63. There was a government report released in 1963 on jobs and education, again, discrimination against women. And it said very clearly that women were discriminated against in both jobs and education in America. Clearly, flat out, simply put, women were discriminated and treated unfairly when it came to any type of application, whether it be an education application or a job application. As a result, we actually see some legal challenges and some legal changes come about. Um, The Equal Pay Act, which stated women were to be paid equally for doing the same work as a man. Equal Pay Act, which ironically enough meant that jobs were supposed to pay you the same for doing it as a man, but lots of employers got around this. One, some simply didn't do it. After all, how do you know? How do you know if you're a woman and you're doing X job and the guy next to you is doing the same exact job? How do you know how much he makes? You don't. So how can you even know whether you're paid as much as him? This is one of the biggest problems. Pay is something that's not talked about. You're not supposed. Your employers even tell you don't talk about how much money you make. So how to actually enforce Equal Pay Act? Really tough to do. Really tough to do because it's a hush hush thing. Companies don't release. I mean, obviously, don't release a list saying, okay, Joe makes this and Wilma makes this. They don't release a list of everyone's wages. That's a privacy issue. So how do you actually even know whether you are being paid fairly or not? You don't. And then furthermore, due to the fact this pay is often subjective. Oh, you're doing more work than him, or he's doing more work than you, or he's got more high profile accounts than you, or he did a better job last quarter than you. So, valuations, there's just so many ways to get around equal pay that the Equal Pay Act sets this bar of equality for men and women that is really almost unenforceable due to so many loopholes, so many ways around it. Simply changing a job title. All you got to do is change one word in a job title. And even though the man and the woman do the same work, give the man a different job title by one word, and you can pay him whatever you want because it's a different job title. So you can simply say he makes more because it's a different job. I mean, there's so many ways around it that it's really it looks great on paper, but the actual enactment of the Equal Pay Act is really challenging. And then we do, I actually mentioned it before, we add sex to the Civil Rights Act, where women can't be discriminated based upon sex. That was added to the Civil Rights Act of 64. That was added in, looks like 66. I think that was added in 66. I think that's what my notes say. Then we have NOW, which was talked about up here, National Organization of Women was created. That is still around, I believe. That still exists. It was specifically supposed to it was specifically created to enforce this, the Sex and the Civil Rights Act, to enforce women not being discriminated on based upon their gender. It was modeled after the NAACP, so the same type of organization, same type of structure as NAACP, which was a very successful organization to basically advocate for civil rights for women, the same way NAACP advocated for civil rights for men, or for black people, Uh, successful, and now is still very successful. That is still an organization. I feel very certain that is still an organization that is still out there advocating for women's rights. Well, we get to it. We briefly talked about it before. Now we're going to talk about it. The war in Vietnam, which, by the way, was not a war officially, never declared war. It was a police action, a peacekeeping force. Yeah. Yeah, it was a war. Deadliest war we've ever been involved in, other than the American Civil War. Um, Kennedy set us on a course in this war, really. While we had been involved in Vietnam in some way all the way back to the 40s, it was primarily just as advisors. Kennedy, though, really sets us on a path. He really gets the ball rolling on Vietnam. He starts to make commitments under his presidency, specifically because of communism. He takes it upon himself, well, as president, that's really what he's supposed to do, to really fight communism. And he believes Vietnam was going to be his Korea. Vietnam was going to be his way because Korea was, at least a partial success. Is going to be his way of it's his legacy. One of the things to be his legacy to really defeat and challenge the Soviets because the Soviets had come after him since the beginning. So just in general, it was going to be his way to really fight against communism. Um, well, LBJ comes into office, so it really gets started under Kennedy. LBJ comes into office, and LBJ is he actually wants to sort of back out a little bit. But he believes to actually back out of protecting Vietnam will damage the American image. Because after all, we have portrayed ourselves now for 20 years as the global protectors and the defenders against communism. And generally speaking, any type of totalitarian, militarily dominant governments. We have pretty much portrayed to the world Europe, the Middle East, Asia, we'll come running if you come calling, and we're going to defend you against militaristic governments and communistic governments. So for us to back out of Vietnam, once we'd already sort of committed under Kennedy, it would have really made us look bad. So this was an image thing as much as actually helping Vietnam. And LBJ sticks with it. And him and Kennedy really put us on this course, which is what when we went into Vietnam, it was very popular. Very popular. I mean, many people are familiar with all the bad press that comes and all how negative it is and how soldiers were treated and how this was so terrible. It was. But when we started into it, people were incredibly positive. If you go back to after 9/11 and the bombing of the World Trade Centers, and then the huge public approval of George Bush about us going and getting the terrorists, going after them, the approval ratings were through the roof. Not everybody, no, of course not, but the majority of Americans were well behind. We're going to get them back. We're going to take vengeance. We're going to be America strong. We're going to protect ourselves. A huge swell of patriotism against the bad guys and or the good guys. Same thing here. When it initially started, we were going to be the saviors, the protectors, the helpers. We were going to be the ones to actually come in and protect Vietnam, protect the world from communist aggression. Everybody was behind it until it really started to work its way out, and then lots of things changed. In 1964, LBJ receives reports that North Vietnamese torpedo boats fired on the U.S. destroyer Maddox. So North Vietnamese, communist-controlled torpedo boats fired on the U.S. destroyer Maddox. A lot of mixed reports came in. Matter of fact, when it actually finally panned out, it looked like the only actual damage done to the Maddox was a single bullet hole. One single bullet hole. Then there was a second attack on the Maddox. That was then determined after the fact to be a misread radar signal, which is relatively new technology. So the two attacks on American ships and American troops was one, a single bullet shot, no one injured, and a mistake. There was no attack. Well, all right. Now, LBJ took action on this. Now, don't get me wrong, the initial reports were that we were being attacked. The initial reports came in as they were overinflated. They came in that we actually were under some type of attack. And LBJ also believed violence was inevitable. He believed Vietnam was going to escalate due to communist aggression. Well, he wasn't wrong about that. He wasn't wrong. Vietnam was going to escalate. So he was right about that. But the inevitability of conflict didn't have to involve us. But as I already said, we had to be the ones. That was how we had basically created this image in America of we're the ones that are going to come and take care of you and protect you, and so we have to do this. This leads to congressional action, what is known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This was passed almost unanimously in Congress. You must understand, the same way as most people in Congress were fully behind all type of actions in the Middle East after 9/11, pretty much Congress was voted 90-95%. Republican or Democrat. This was a huge nonpartisan issue. Everybody was on board. Same thing here. Almost everybody in Congress, Republican or Democrat, was on board with this. Let's go and take action. We are going to save Vietnam. Same thing. Overwhelming public opinion, and of course his reelection. Again, look at his reelection. What happened? It was almost a landslide victory, in part due to this. What happened here? In essence, Congress gave him the freedom to conduct the war almost as a I forget the term. The War Powers Act basically allows him to do anything. It gives him almost full and total authority to conduct the war however he wants. And the war begins. But it's not a declared war. Congress doesn't declare war. Congress says what we are going to do is have a peace action, a police action. We're going to go in and protect the Vietnamese. We're not going to war with anyone. We're not going to war with Vietnam. We're not going to war with the Chinese. We're not going to war with Russia. We're just going to go in and protect the Vietnamese people. No war. But it is a war. It totally is. But it just wasn't ever declared. Now, again, we'd been in Vietnam all the way back from the 40s. We'd really only been advisors, though. So the first actual real American ground forces, troops on the ground, prepared to fight one-on-one with aggressors, was in 65. 65 is when we have the first real troops. We begin this war, which lasts for 8 years. We don't really walk away from Vietnam completely until 73. By 1968, 3 years in, we had 500,000 troops in Vietnam. It's not a war, though. Again, we're there just to keep the peace. We're there just to defend Vietnam from communist aggression. It's not really a war. Yeah. The reality is, this is no longer a war between North and South Vietnam. This is really a war between America and North Vietnam. We weren't the only troops there. There were other troops. This was actually a United Nations thing. So there were other troops there. But really, by 1968, this was a war of U.S. versus communist North Vietnam. That's really what it was. Bombing campaign known as Operation Rolling Thunder commences in the mid-60s. We drop about 1,000,000 tons of bombs on the North Vietnam. Just under 1,000,000 tons of bombs just in North Vietnam. So what's known as ordnance. Ordnance is explosives and bombs. So 1,000,000 tons of ordnance in North Vietnam over the next year and a half. The bombing had almost no effect. We believe the bombing campaign had almost no effect whatsoever. Now, it killed untold innocent number of people, and I'm sure a few soldiers too. But the reality is, the fighting and the strength and the power of North Vietnamese never ever subsided. It never reduced. Matter of fact, they actually got more aggressive. Um, they certainly got more aggressive. Destroyed jungles and towns across the entire peninsula. We think probably over 100,000 civilian casualties. 100,000 civilian non-combatants killed due to the bombing campaigns. Now, our justification for this was simple. The soldiers are getting support from the villages. They're getting food from the villages. They're getting places. They're getting clothes. They're getting supplies from the villages. In other words, if the villages don't exist, then the soldiers are going to run out of food and supplies. Not to mention, the villages have their families. So we'll threaten them by killing their families, destroying their families. Now, this was not explicitly the public image of the government. They would never come out and say we're targeting civilians. But it becomes very obvious, right, through the freedom of information, through the release of records. It's very clear the government knew for years that they were bombing and killing innocents in villages, and they continue to be approved. Continue to be approved under LBJ and under Nixon. Continues to be approved, these campaigns, which are obviously killing innocent people. They continue to do it. North Vietnam proves very resolute. If anything, we think they actually fought harder and stronger. Because now it proves right that we're bad. It proves that America's evil. Because look how many innocent people are dying and being killed. So it proves that we're the bad guys. So we actually see North Vietnamese support for the war increase dramatically. We believe this actually makes the war worse and harder to win after the fact. Now, during the fact, we thought it was going to soften up and kill the enemy, but actually, this made the war worse. They felt that they had to fight now. They had to fight even more so. And of course, there's always the concern. What if we get in war with China? Because North Vietnam borders China. Could this war actually spill into a real official war with China? Which we did not want. We did not want that. This was another proxy war. This is a war in a country, a small country, that is being supported on one side by communists, a large communist power, on the other side by a large American democratic power. Yeah. Here's Vietnam, Vietnamese map. We have North Vietnam, South Vietnam, China right here. These are neutral areas. Cambodia, Laos, these are some neutral areas. And these neutral areas were also often hurt, often damaged. We see neutral areas, innocents being killed too. Ho Chi Minh Trail. We're going to talk about the Tet Offensive here in a second. This is where the North Vietnamese actually invaded South Vietnam, but they didn't go through Vietnam, which was full of military troops, 500,000 military troops. They completely went into a neutral area went to a neutral country of Cambodia, went through the whole thing, and then invaded Vietnam all along the way, completely going around the American troops. It was actually quite genius. They simply circumvented all the American defenses and went around them, being attacked from behind in many cases. We There was defensive lines, and you have this direction towards the enemy, as it says on a claymore. this um, and they simply went around behind. We'll get to that Tet Offensive in a second. Yeah. U.S. troops in Vietnam chart. So under Kennedy's really started. Still primarily advisors. LBJ escalates, and under LBJ's presidency, we get up to 500,000 troops. In a way, all the things LBJ was doing at home, this sort of negates that. All these great things LBJ was doing, creating our greatest social welfare system up to that point in time, the Great Society, all the while he was doing this, sending ultimately millions of troops. Ultimately, we had over 2-3 million troops that went to Vietnam, a couple million troops that went there. This continues to escalate. And then after Nixon comes in, Nixon starts to draw us down out of it. Nixon starts to bring us out of the war. When it becomes clear we can't win, if Nixon believed we could have won the war, he would have probably stayed in. But it becomes clear we can't win, and eventually we do start to walk away from it. All right, the war in Vietnam, public opinion. Early on, everybody supported it. Early on, media, public support, television, news. Generally speaking, early on, majority American support. Certainly in 65 and 66. However, the more and more television coverage shows how bad it really is, how many people are really dying, innocents dying, civilians dying. The more and more that happens, the more and more reports that show the dead, the wounded, including footage of U.S. Marines using flamethrowers burning entire villages with women, men, women, and children in them, burning people alive. Yeah, there's footage of that. That kind of footage finally makes it back to Americans, and they start looking at it, and people are aghast. People are like, "What? What are you doing?" I mean, it really, public opinion by 66 really starts to change. Piles of bodies, piles of dead bodies, accusations of war crimes against American soldiers, raping and killing women and children, all of which, don't get me wrong, all is the wrong way to put it, many of which turned out to be true. The atrocities committed in Vietnam was unbelievable. Don't get me wrong, Vietnamese were doing similar stuff. The North Vietnamese were doing atrocities as well. And that's probably why it escalated that way. They were doing incredibly violent, destructive, murderous, torture and rape and all kinds of stuff. And our American soldiers, many of them started doing the same stuff. They came too close. They were too close to the enemy, and they came to start to look like the enemy. Um, it's an escalation. If they're going to do it, we're going to do it. There's a thing we say in the military, if they bring a knife, you bring a gun. If they bring a gun, you bring a cannon. If they bring a cannon, you bring a tank. That's the way it works. It's constant escalation. And so the more and more violent it gets, you often see the counter violence to that escalate. And unfortunately, when you're fighting wars, they often spill over to civilian populations. They pretty much always do, which happens here. But 1967, opinions changed. Dead soldiers and civilian deaths. However, the government has continued telling us we're winning. The government continues to say we're winning, we're doing the good work, we are doing God's work, we're over there protecting and helping innocents and civilians, and we are going to save Vietnam. But the more and more the TV newspaper reports come back, which really show that the official version is actually a lie. The government is hiding numbers. Many newspaper agencies are reporting that the death numbers, actual death totals being reported by the government, may be half of what the actual death totals are. They're not even including all the people missing in action, thousands and thousands of soldiers missing in action. not even including the tens of thousands, POWs, prisoners of war. We really don't know how many prisoners of war there are until the war is over and realize that there's tens of thousands of American soldiers that are simply missing. Some are assumed dead, but many are thought to be prisoners of war. It takes us decades to get those people back. Meanwhile, they're in these terrible prison camps being tortured and brutal. I mean, it's just crazy. It just turns out that the government is pretty much glossing over all of it, trying to make it look better than it is. But more and more reporting, more and more reporters on the ground really becomes what we call the credibility gap. This gap between what's credible, between where the government is telling us this, but the reality is actually this. And this gap continues to widen during the war. It widens under LBJ and it widens under Nixon, to where the government is constantly downplaying how bad it is and overplaying how good we're doing. But a lot of that is not, it's just, well, just frankly, just false information. Also, the costs. The financial costs are really understated as well. The financial commitment was increasing dramatically. The financial commitment, well, if we look at it this way, in 1967, our federal deficit, let's try this again. The federal deficit is $23 billion. That was our largest federal deficit ever. And it wasn't because of LBJ's social programs, the Great Society. It was the war. It was the war cost. Our greatest expenditure by 68 was the war, which wasn't even a war officially. Massive increased military spending. Another major problem which really developed was the nationwide anti-war movement, which is often led by you guys. The anti-war movement was begun and led and pushed by college students all through the 60s and 70s. This becomes a nationwide movement, coast to coast. Very critical of the U.S. policy in Vietnam. Very critical of the government lying. And of course, the government taking all these young men and women, men mostly, but women too, taking them to war and them dying on the other side of the world. Meanwhile, the government's lying to us the whole time. And by 68, 69, most people started to believe the idea of an actual anti-communist Vietnam, an actual saving of Vietnam, was simply unattainable. And the number of deaths was simply unacceptable. So by 68, 69, the majority of Americans had turned against the war and believed we could not win, and we were now losing American lives for nothing. It simply needed to end. The war was thought to be unwinnable by 69. Turns out it was. It was an unwinnable conflict. If we'd stayed in 10 more years, we probably wouldn't have won this conflict. There was really no winning. There was just losing for everybody. Well, let's move to the students. The student movement. All right, the rise of the student movement. Who was the largest group protesting the war? Really was students, college students. The new left. We really have a left and a right version. We have a very more liberal and a much more conservative version in colleges. Even though colleges do seem to lean liberal today, the reality is, in this time period, it's probably a very even split. About half of college students lean liberal and about half lean conservative. The New Left were the radical liberals, composed of several different groups. For once, SDS was one. Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. This was formed at the University of Michigan in 1960, and they specifically formed to lead the anti-war movement. This SDS was created specifically to lead the anti-war movement. They ended up doing other things too, but that was their focus. We see SDS and others usually manifest themselves at large universities and large college towns across the country. So wherever you find big schools or big college towns, I remember where I lived in Indiana. I lived in Bloomington, Indiana for a while, a couple years. Half of that entire population of that town is college students, the IU, Indiana University. In the like in the off season when school's out, half of the town's gone. It's literally 50% of the population is the college when the college is in session. It's a huge university. So you have college towns, which are incredibly driven by the entire college economy and the students, and college campuses all across America, coast to coast, all across America. Free speech movement, that comes about in 1964 at Berkeley here in California. That happens at UC Berkeley. So we have SDS founded in University of Michigan, Free Speech Movement founded here in Berkeley in 64. This was evidence of students' desire to protest university policies. This was specifically targeting university, or what we'll start hearing the term, the establishment. Or you'll also hear the term the man. We'll talk a little more about that when we talk about hippies. The man. So they're going to challenge the man, they're going to challenge the establishment, and they sure as hell don't want to be drafted to go off to war. Um, one of the reasons this actually forms at Berkeley is Berkeley actually bans student protests on campus. They actually ban it. No more student protests on campus. They also banned any type of political marches, political rallies. They banned student organizations that were thought to be political. But you must understand, Berkeley did this unfairly. The free speech thing is questionable, but Berkeley would ban liberal or anti-war or peace groups, but they let the more conservative groups go. They did not. And their argument was simple. Well, they're not disturbing the peace. They're not having big marches and big rallies. They're being calm, quiet, having small organizations and meetings while you guys are out marching and protesting and burning flags and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. Therefore, we're going to ban you, but we're not going to ban the conservative ones. That was also a big argument. That is also not fair. You can't ban one side but not the other. But of course, Berkeley argued, well, the other isn't making all the uproar. The other was the silent majority, which we'll probably get into a little bit in this chapter. I'm not going to get into it right now. Let's see. Um, they also protested actions of politicians regarding civil rights issue. Free speech also spoke out for civil rights issues. Then in 1971, let's see if else. Yeah, civil rights, Vietnam, authoritarian censorship. That was authoritarian censorship. That was the college censoring them. Then 1971, the Selective Service changes its policies. This is what, if you're 18 years old as a guy, you register. You have to register a Selective Service, which is more commonly known as the draft. This is the last time we had a draft. They abolished their policy of exempting students. What? Yeah. So they abolish exempting students, and so now you can be drafted as a student. This led, of course, to further protests. Many college students left the country for Canada, right off to Canada, or they got bone spurs repeatedly. Yeah, we can look that one up. Bone spurs repeatedly, so of course you're unfit for service. They left for Canada. They applied for CO, conscientious objector status. Um, yeah, yeah. The story really changes for a lot of college students once they realize they can get drafted. Then the protests really ramp up. Anti-war activism escalates as well. Um, we see men of college age usually leading riots, break-ins, large demonstrations. And then in the 1960s, we see hundreds of thousands march on Washington and San Francisco, multiple different marches in the 60s, hundreds of thousands, anti-war rallies, hundreds of thousands of people marching. It isn't just students. Students were one of the biggest leaders of this. But you have a lot of people, middle class people, white, black, doesn't matter. Lots of people are really starting to protest the war by 68 to 70, really. The country is turned against the war. We don't want to be in it. We don't want to be involved. We want to get out of it. It's really tearing the country apart. This whole war was. All right. Well, the other side of it's the new right, more conservative. The Young Americans for Freedom, for instance, they come around the same time period that they are created. They're conservative students who really emphasize God's hand in politics and American society. We really see that as their biggest focus, focusing on how religion is really shaping our society and believing everything we're doing, the government is doing, is really all the work of God. How God's hand is heavily influential in politics and society. The YAF becomes the largest student organization in the U.S. Ultimately, with I don't know, like a million members or something. Huge organization across the U.S. College students, supports pretty much any government U.S. policies. Pretty much any policies regarding war or anything to do with the Cold War or anti-communist, they start to support. They do call for smaller government. They support the policy in Vietnam. They support capitalism and consumerism in general. Um, this is really becomes the basis for modern conservatism. Groups like this is really what lead us into a conservative revolution, which occurs in the 70s, which we will talk about. Let's see what else we want to talk about here. Conservative middle class in college, composed of veterans and millions more. WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, lots of suburbanites. Young Americans for Freedom were thought to be about 98% white, almost entirely white and mostly middle class. White, mostly middle class. They became the basis for college conservative movements of the 70s and 80s, which of course helped elect Reagan, Nixon, others. Um, and many people who work in government in the 80s and 90s under like Reagan and Bush were part of the YAF back in the 60s and 70s. This really creates a whole new generation of conservative politicians and conservative advocates in America, which brings us the conservative rebirth, which really happens in the 70s and 80s. The basis for modern conservatism is an outgrowth of this YAF and others. Don't get me wrong, there's other groups too. YAF is just the big one, the most influential. The counterculture, the hippies. Yeah, make love, not war. Hey, man, give me some of that smoke. That kind of stuff, you know. Now outside both these groups, this is certainly this is certainly a total third separate group. Doesn't really fit in any other category. The counterculture. This was revolt against the man, revolt of any types of authority. I mean, hell, if you're going to be in one of these groups, this would be the best, right? This would be the most fun. Lots of sex, lots of drug use, rock and roll, and stand high. I mean, come on, what else could you ask for, right? Yeah. This was a revolt against any authority, revolt against authority, a revolt against middle class ideals, a revolt against military, a revolt against having work in general or jobs, any type of structure, the revolt against the government. It was a revolt against everything, basically. Anything and everything that made you do anything or act in a certain way or dress a certain way or say anything a certain way, F that. I'm going to do what I want, feel what I want, smoke what I want, have sex when I want, just whatever you want. These were the hippies, tie-dye shirts, baggy jeans, long hair. They celebrate folk music and rock music, lots of drug use. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Doors. Now that's really where it moved into. Originally, it was like 60s folk music, a lot of stuff we haven't even heard of. But then by the 60s, 70s, it really moves into more of the popular rock and roll. These rebellious bands often represent the divide of the hippies and the youth against the man. We don't like the man. Anything government we don't like. Recreational drug use is common: LSD, marijuana. They were often dubbed flower children by the media. They didn't call themselves that, but the media really starts calling them flower children. That's where I guess that comes from. Make love, not war. Media coverage also gave the appearance that all American youth was participating in all-out revolt. The media really made it look like all Americans were in this some sort of all-out revolt. They're either all part of the left and this marching on the streets, or they're all smoking pot or marijuana. They're all hanging out at Woodstock. They're burning flags, all this kind of stuff. The reality is, most Americans were not. Most Americans were not. The protests we see in the streets, the newspaper coverage, the television coverage, the movies, that's really 10%. The reality is 80-90% of people are just going to school, going to work, taking care of their families, hanging out. Most people are not doing this stuff. In any of these groups, the majority of Americans are not. Most Americans are simply going about their regular lives. However, all you see in the media is all this stuff. And so it gives the impression that everybody's like this. It's not, though. The vast majority of Americans were not involved in any of this stuff. But it doesn't look that way when you look at the news media coverage. It looks like our whole country's on fire. And the reality is, most people, pardon me, most people it was not. Part 3, Days of Rage, 68 to 72, Blood in the Streets in 68. 68 was a very tragic year for America. The number of deaths, tens and tens of thousands of deaths in the war. Assassination of Kennedy, assassination of Martin Luther King, combined with the violence and the riots, the protests, race riots from coast to coast, from New York to San Francisco to Los Angeles. Many people would get this feeling of hopelessness and fear Between all the stuff you see on the news, all the violence, all the escalation, the war, many people start to have incredibly high anxiety, really feeling that America is falling apart. It wasn't. As I just talked about, it wasn't. But if you watch the news every day, it gives you the impression that America is going to shit. That literally our whole freaking country is just crumbling. It wasn't. Most people were simply going to school and going to work and going about their lives. The death rate for the American soldiers really achieved a high in 68. By 1968, American soldiers were dying at several hundred a week, 300 every single week. In 1968, the Viet Cong, that is the North Vietnamese, that's the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong launched an attack on Tet. The Tet is a holiday. It's a Vietnamese holiday. The Vietnamese New Year. A truce had been declared between North and South Vietnam, which we were honoring. American soldiers were looking forward to having a holiday, some time off. They were probably going to sit around, drink some beer, look for prostitutes. They were probably looking for a lot of just chilling out, blowing off some steam. The truce was called. The North Vietnamese had never obviously intended on that. They went down that path through Cambodia, Ho Chi Minh Trail. They snuck thousands and thousands of soldiers through Cambodia, and then they launched a massive attack on South Vietnam on Tet. It was terrible. Now, technically, the Viet Cong lost this. They lost most of the soldiers. Most of the soldiers, it was a suicide mission to do massive damage to the South, to demoralize the South, to demoralize Americans, while most of them realized they were probably going to be killed in the process. For most of them, it was a one-way trip. Technically, it was a Viet Cong loss. But the reality was, it was a South Vietnam American loss. Because it showed how weak we really were. It showed that even in the heart of American protected territory, deep in Vietnam, where it should have been perfectly safe, the Viet Cong were able to strike and kill people. Yeah. The loss was to the North, the communists, but the actual loss was the psychological loss to America, the morale. We realized we were nowhere. 3 years in this conflict, and we couldn't protect any of our cities in Vietnam, any of the Vietnamese cities. We could not protect any of the troops. Americans were dying. Vietnamese civilians were dying. It just showed that we were 3 years into this conflict, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands dead, and we really hadn't even begun to win. As the media coverage escalates over the violence and the murders, it really hurts LBJ's credibility. Many people really come to believe that the war is unwinnable. Public opinion continues to turn against him, continues to turn against the government in general. Many people believe we should not be involved. He didn't even run for re-election in 68. He believed that he would probably not win. Had he won, had he ran, maybe, but who knows? But he just believed that it was so bad, he didn't even go for it. He's very despairing over this. He wanted to do so much to help America, and this really destroyed his presidency in many ways. In 68, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, of course, in Memphis. We see riots. We see riots erupt across the country. Dozens dead, millions in damages. Robert Kennedy, of course, Robert Kennedy comes along. Robert Kennedy, who was JFK's brother, he pleads for the nation to follow Martin Luther King's example, don't resort to violence, to find passion and to look for hope, to look for the promise of a better America. He was going to probably run for president, and he's assassinated a month later in June in Los Angeles in 68. He's killed. Yeah, this war really destroyed the entire liberal dream. It really destroyed everything. LBJ was on such a path to success. so popular. And the Vietnam War, it was his way, it was his turn to fight communism. It was his turn to be the hero, to have the victories against the communists, um, that JFK had, that Eisenhower had, that Truman had. Even though we're limited, all of those presidents had some victories. They had some authority. They had some real way of showing, we did win, we did have better relations with the Soviets. We did partially win Korea. Um, we protected, we stopped the Cuba. We're protecting Berlin. I mean, every president had victories in the war against communism. LBJ hadn't. It was his time to shine. And he literally stepped into a clusterfuck. It ruined him. It ruined the liberal dream. It ruined all of that. And then Nixon comes along, and Nixon gets us out of the war. And therefore, Nixon is portrayed as a hero. His career is destroyed, but for a separate thing. But yeah, so between what LBJ does, the war, all the disasters that come about it, so many deaths, so much misery brought on by it, it really sort of puts a bookend on liberal America for generations. That began under FDR and really ends with LBJ. The anti-war movement in the '68 election. Oh, Chicago. Yeah. As if it could not get worse for the liberal Democrats. Yeah. The Democratic Convention in Chicago became a stage for what became known as the Siege of Chicago. Remember, Democrats are in charge, height of the war, they're getting all the blame, very clearly. LBJ, Congress is getting all the blame for this. So the Democratic Party has, as it does every single 4 years, Democrats, Republicans, they have their big, typically we call the National Convention, the nominating convention. The Democrats had their nominating convention in the summer of '68 in Chicago. And so activists and protesters come from around the country to either protest the Democratic Party, believing they've done terrible things. Again, they're the ones really, again, the president's Democrats, so therefore responsible for the war, or to advocate their positions, to get the Democratic Party to change policies and views, to be anti-war. So either they're coming there to challenge the Democratic Party and their policies and platforms, or they're there hoping to influence their policies and platforms, or to disrupt the convention, or protest the war, or any number of a dozen things. Thousands descend on Chicago. Tens of thousands descend around the convention center. It is a circus. It's crazy. And, well, the police are asked and ordered to take action. Who did this? I've never really been sure, but it seems like maybe the Democratic nominating committee, the actual Democratic, it's known as the DNC. I don't know if they called it back then, but their whole separate, like, Democratic nominating committee. They're the ones that they're sort of the ones that run the Democratic Party, I guess, officially. Anyway, so whoever asked it for, they asked the police to actually get out there and sort of break up the protest, sort of take some action, all on the night of the presidential nomination. Well, rioting occurs. We see police using tear gas, clubs, dogs, violence. All of this right outside the Democratic Convention. All of it with the Democratic Convention in the backdrop, police beating people on the streets. So pretty much all of it was reflected directly on the Democratic Party. Wow. Yeah. It was almost nothing. I mean, it just couldn't get any worse for them. Democrats lose credibility, lose support. Then we switch gears to Richard Nixon. So Richard Nixon comes into the scene. Now, Richard Nixon ran for election several times. He had lost back in '60. He'd run for election in 62, wasn't for president, but he'd run in 62. He'd lost there too. He was a well-known name in Republican circles. He was determined to take the nomination for the Republicans. He said he was the best man to take the job. He said he was the best man for president. A lot of blue-collar workers, many blue-collar workers, which had traditionally been Democrat, at least since FDR, they turned to the Republican Party. Why? Bottom line, many people in America blamed all the chaos and everything on the Democrats because they had been now president. The Democrats had now run Washington for 8 years, from FDR, pardon me, from JFK to LBJ. So for 8 years, Democrats have been in charge. Look what we got: chaos, blood in the streets, violence, protests, increasing racial violence, race riots, murders, the war in Vietnam. In essence, many people simply turned their back on the Democratic Party, believing the Democrats had gone astray and were really not trustworthy anymore. So we see lots of people leave them, lots of workers turn to the Republican Party, believing Nixon was, an alternative to bring peace, stability, prosperity to America. Um, they also feared communism. They also feared the counterculture. The idea of counterculture and hippies and LSD and drugs, because what were they so feared about? Their kids. They feared their children falling under the sway of this liberalism and this counterculture, which is often associated with more democratic views. And we were certainly concerned about communism. There were certainly still concerns about communism. Often the counterculture and drug use and liberalism was often associated with socialism, which is associated with the communism. So some simply saw Democrats as sort of associated or friendly towards communism. Um, Democrats were blamed for causing it all or simply not fixing it. Either way, whether the Democrats caused it or they didn't fix it, either way, they were blamed. Now, this is more in the North. What about in the South? So in the South, he has an interesting strategy. We call this Southern strategy. There were lots of private promises given to Southern politicians, lots of behind the door, behind the scenes, behind closed door arguments, where he promised to stop enforcing any civil rights issues. Remember, Congress makes laws, but the executive branch, the president, is the one who actually enforces the laws. Congress makes them, the president enforces them. Nixon said, I won't enforce any civil rights advocacy. I won't enforce any civil rights laws. Laws are there. I can't change the laws, but I'm not going to enforce the laws. I'm not going to push for any rights, any more rights. I'm not going to push any more social programs. I'm basically going to stop all that stuff. I am not going to do anything more to help minorities. You simply need to support me. You need to help me. Now, we know all this for a fact because we have all of Nixon's recordings. As we'll talk about, Nixon recorded everything he said in the Oval Office. And so even though this occurs before he's in office, once he's in office, he has many meetings with people who he made these promises to. And then he sits down in these meetings like, remember, I promised all this stuff to you and I said all this to you. Or people would come in his office and be like, hey, you promised us this, and you need to deliver on this. And Nixon's like, okay, I'll do this. In his own words, we know everything Nixon did. Even though much of it is recorded after the fact, he loved to just talk. There's like hundreds, thousands of hours of his talking. He just loved to talk and talk and talk. And so we know pretty much every innermost thought of Richard Nixon, every single thing he thought. And he was racist, he was prejudiced, he was bigoted, he was sexist, he was terrible, frankly. But you know what? For all we know, a lot of presidents have been like that. We haven't got firsthand recordings of them like Nixon recorded himself doing all this stuff. Anyway, he makes all these agreements, all these quiet votes that he will do all this stuff, and this is where we start talking about the quiet voice of the silent majority. These are many people who believe that they had been forgotten, and all the chaos and stuff going on in the streets and the media. They said, "Well, no one's talking about us. We're still going to work, still doing our jobs. We are the silent majority." And truthfully, they were. They were the majority of Americans. And they were the silent ones. They were not the ones marching in the streets or protesting. Um, the non-shouters, non-violent middle-class Americans, which were mostly white conservative voters. He won the election as the white South moved to the Republican Party, and we see republicanism and conservatism take over the South under Nixon, and it has never looked back. Today, still, the southern states are primarily conservative, right-leaning, southern and Midwest. Still are. 50 years later, he really creates this Republican conservative base in the southern and Midwestern states, the silent majority, which takes over conservative politics in America. And still today, that is generally where we see the base. The coasts are much more to be likely to be liberal or Democrat, while the center and the southeast of America are more likely to be conservative Republican strongholds. Conservative middle class suburbanites and small towns. Really interesting. Really interesting stuff. This really creates the modern political spectrum under Nixon. To what LBJ did and Nixon did, this pretty much creates the mold for the modern political dichotomy in America. Liberal conservative, Republican Democrat, pretty much is created between LBJ and Nixon. It had been going for a long time. Literally, you could actually trace the beginnings of this all the way back to Wilson in the 19 teens. But it really becomes sort of cemented in place in the 1970s. So Nixon wins the election versus Hubert Humphrey, really close election. Split in the popular vote, 50-50. He does not win the majority of Americans. He only gets 43%. Yeah. Had George Wallace not been in here, it's really hard to know. It's really hard to know where it would have gone. George, because these states here had gone Republican. So these would have probably gone to Nixon. These states would have probably gone Nixon had George Wallace not been in there. So he would have probably won. Probably. It's really hard to know. It's a really unusual election. It's a really strange one. And yeah, all you have to do is get a plurality. You don't have to get a majority, or you have to get a majority to get a plurality. I hope I'm saying that right. Regardless of whether I said it right or not. Bottom line is, you don't have to get over 50%. You simply have to get the most. Whoever gets the most. He got the most. He got 301 electoral votes. All you have to do is get more than anyone else. So you can have a three. You could even technically have a four-way split. You could have a four-way split. You could have someone being elected president only getting 30% of the vote. You could. Hasn't happened, but you could. Could you imagine that, having someone elected as leader of our country that only 30% of the people or 35% of the people voted for him? Not that far off here for Nixon, nonetheless. It's the way it is. Um, yeah, skip this. I'm not going to worry about this nationalist turn. I'm going to skip over that. I will, though, start with D here, Women's Liberation Movement. So you can skip C. I could go back and take it off the slide or whatever, and now you won't even see it, but I'm just not going to worry about it. I'm just telling you. Just skip over C. Let's go to Women's Lib movement here. New call for women's liberation in the 60s. Young college-educated feminists, well-versed in the New Left ideology. They wanted to be more than just typists. They wanted to be more than just housewives. They wanted to actually be contributing, successful members of society, having independence and freedom. They don't want to be the domestic. They don't want to have the feminine mystique. They really believe in female empowerment, or what usually you'd hear them the word tossed around is women's lib. Women are a sisterhood of women working together to promote women's causes. Women for women. Women to stand up for women. So, ladies, your focus shouldn't be on your husband or your families. That they're important, but your first focus should be on women, yourself, your own self. In other words, you first, and then your family and kids second. This is more of a left liberal movement, because the conservative side of this would be exactly opposite. And they would say the highest ideal and the highest concern of the woman is the family and the kids. That is first. And then anything you want should be secondary to that. Women's Lib says the other way around. Your needs first, and then your family and all the rest of that comes second. Because you have to take care of you first, and you have to deal with your own psychology first, then you can be a better person to everybody and be better for everyone, including yourself. They wanted this women's lib. They said that while women are often seen as nothing more than, this is the terminology, a slab of meat is a term you would see in this time period. It's really challenging objectivism, the objectification of women, that women are not really treated as people. They're treated as a placeholder at home to be the mother, the wife, the child care, etc. They wanted equality. They wanted to end exploitation of women. They wanted to. They believed women were objectified. They went against. They challenged prostitution. Things like this. They called for marches. They called for demonstrations. They wanted equality. We see terms like sexism and male chauvinism become more commonly used. The idea of being sexist against women or a chauvinist against women. Being disrespectful towards women in general becomes a lot more common. Challenging how women are being disrespected, challenging male authority and dominance in America, which has a way it's always been. So patriarchal society has been the way of the world for pretty much ever. So this change is really trying to change up what had been the structure of human civilization since the beginning of time. Let me say it differently. Since the beginning of recorded history, 5,000 years, as far as we know. So for 5,000 years, patriarchal male-led society had always been the norm. And now they're really trying to challenge that, saying it shouldn't be. Priorities are health care, child care, equal pay, abortion rights. Um, they ask for the government to pay for child care, to pay the government to give abortion rights, for the government to do things to help give women power and authority. They believe all this can really be done through Congress. They believe that's the best way to do it. The laws have to be changed. Bottom line, you're not going to change people's minds, or only change some people's minds, but if we change the laws, then we change everything. African American women, Latino women, they really remained on the periphery of this. We see minorities often remaining on the periphery of this. Um, these women's rights organizations are usually focused on white women. Even though they're advocating for rights for all women, we'll find that mostly, it's white middle class women doing all this. White educated middle class women doing all this. Mostly. Let's see what else we want to talk about here. Let's see what else I want to talk about. See if there's anything I missed in here. They want laws that specifically address sexual assaults. They want anti-rape laws. Not just that it's simply a crime, but they want laws that specifically talk about punishments for rapes, sexual assault, domestic violence, harassment of women, harassment in the workplace, especially. We do actually see an increase. They want abortion laws. I already said that. We do actually see an increase in the number of universities that actually accept women due to Title IX. Title IX of the American Education Act of 1972. The American Education Act of 1972. I left the American word out here. It's because I ran out of room. This prohibited college universities who took federal money from discriminating against women. Okay. So Title IX of the American Education Act says, very simply put, if you take government money, you cannot discriminate against women in any way, shape, or form. They must be given full and equal access to all opportunities on college campuses, all jobs, all college education, all degree programs, and athletic programs. Previously to this, almost all athletic programs, like 97%, 96% of education programs at colleges were male only, or 96% were just men. Very few women participated in, I may have said education, I mean exercise, athletics. Only about 4% of women actively participated in college athletic programs. They said that needs to stop. Education discrimination needs to end, needs to change. Women need to have full and equal opportunities in education. Yeah, the women's liberation movement's huge. I mean, you can go back to listen to what I just said over 10 minutes and say and read it again. This is huge. This really pushes the envelope on women's equality in America, and we do become what is generally considered the most liberal society, large society on earth regarding women's rights by the 1970s, 1980s. It is probably one of the best places to live on the planet of a large country, large democratic country on the planet as a woman with so many rights between abortion rights and all kinds of laws that protect women's sexuality and assault and discrimination and equality. It really does. Um, Women really do it. They really change a lot of things. It's really modeled on the civil rights movement. But they shift the whole thing around and they use the entire structure of the civil rights movement from the 40s to the 60s, and they simply replace black with woman. And instead of the civil rights advocacy for blacks, it's become civil rights advocacy for women. And it's really successful. Makes a lot of changes that are really beneficial to women's rights. Which is a real irony of this is that we actually see some of these things actually being turned back today in modern times. We see some of these rights for women's actually backtracking. It's weird, we look back on it, and I would have said years ago, there's no way we'll ever go backwards, and there's no way we'll ever start to go the other direction. America, the world is supposed to be becoming more progressive, more forward thinking. Instead, we see this conservative backlash where actually we see lots of things, people looking backward, wanting things to go back to the way they were. All right, here's your discussion question for this one. We're going to look at these two women. You have this lady here in front of a window, looking at like sort of consumerism here. We have this woman here. All right. All right. Examine the way these women are dressed, the way the two women are dressed in these two images. Think about this. How might the men and women of their parents' generation have reacted to this? Not the women themselves, but how would the men and women, basically mothers and fathers of these two women, have reacted to these images? Think about how different this is from this image of the 1940s and 50s, the ideal image which is portrayed in media of the American housewife. Multiple kids, taking care of the family, being at home. How do you think their parents, the baby boomer generation, how would have they reacted to this sort of, well, look at the two women. Look at some difference. The woman here, the woman has got a relatively short skirt. That is not something that would have been necessarily appropriate for a woman. She's got her legs are bare. You can't tell. She probably has on heels. She's dressed very, very nice like this, very, very feminine, sort of a very revealing outfit. Something that would have been very inappropriate literally just 10 years earlier. Women didn't dress like this in public. This would have been an inappropriate type of attire. Look at the way she's dressed. She's got jeans and boots, a very masculine shirt. She's smoking. Very masculine image. Here we have the woman on the street. Obviously, the more materialistic, a little more. She's shopping in a window. She's got manicured nails. Very much as part of this image of the objectified woman of the 1970s. Here we have this woman who is a hippie. She's at a commune, Drop City hippie commune in New Mexico, 1968. Yeah. Really difficult. I mean, look at the woman. This reveals a lot of her body. Arms, cleavage, legs. This reveals nothing. She's completely covered here. It's really interesting. What would their parents have thought of this? Because these are two extremes. Two very different directions that women went in this time period. From a very middle of the road, very, very more moderate 40s and 50s parents much of the pushback that we see that really sort of revives or enlivens the Republican Party and Nixon is simply the extremes. The idea of many people want things to simply go back to normal, just nice and calm normal in the middle. These are seen as extremes. What do you think their families would have thought about this? Their parents would have thought about this? Pro pro con doesn't matter, good, bad, whatever you think. Just think about that. Think about that, how they would have looked at these women and thought about how these women potentially represented all the things wrong in America. Um, Maybe some parents would have said, "No, this is fine. This is great. You should be free and express yourself and act however you want and be independent." Maybe some would have said it's okay. But think about the majority. Think about the silent majority of the middle class that are really upset with all of the rage in the streets that we see in the 60s. It's interesting. Interesting to think about what these two women represent and how we do see by the 1970s America pretty much pushing back against the representations of these women in many ways. Where do the women go? That'd be interesting too. Stonewall, gay liberation. Come out! It's a good one. Another movement in this period was the gay rights movement, also really structured on the civil rights movement, only replaced black with gay. Inspired by those movements, civil rights movement, black power, liberations movement, many men and women came out by identifying themselves as homosexuals, as gay, even though it was illegal in most states. Yes, the 1970s, most states made any type of any type of. There's different ways of doing it. They name they designed the laws in different ways, but in essence, most of the states in the U.S. had laws against the type of homosexuality. Whether there's different ways of defining it, and they would do this. Most of the time, you would be repressed. You could be thrown in jail. You would be discriminated against by local authorities and local laws and local customs and the government. Most remained in the closet, as the term will often be used. Most remained in the closet, simply afraid of retaliation, not just from society, from their own family, their own friends. You find countless stories of kids that would come out gay and their own parents would reject them, want nothing to do with them, because they would see that really many of the parents would see it as a failure on themselves. We failed. We failed. You're gay because something we did. No, no. As Gaga says, you were born this way. It's the way it is. If you're gay, you're gay. It's not because society made you that way. It's just meant to be. It's the way it is. Well, many people saw this as a problem that you aren't born this way. You aren't supposed to be this way. It's not normal. So the pressure and the stigma of being homosexual was bad. Before this time period, people didn't even come out. You really couldn't. It would destroy you. But in the 70s, we do see an increasing activism and a belief that there's a community that exists, that there are other gay people out there, homosexuals out there that are going to support you. Even if your own personal family and friends may not, you find new friends, find new family if you need to. It's what you have to do. We see the newspaper come out in New York. This is a newspaper, which is a gay newspaper. Yeah, it's a newspaper. It's not a magazine. I don't think it's a newspaper that comes out, and it pushes for gay rights in New York. Incredible amount of resistance and pushback to this. Incredible amount of resistance. Sort of a defining moment is the Stonewall, which we just had the 50-year anniversary of this, of the Stonewall, in Greenwich Village in New York. Defining moment of the gay rights movement. This is the bar, the Stonewall Inn. It was raided by the police in summer of '69. Raided by the police in '69. Gay, lesbian, transsexual patrons. I don't know if we even used the term LGBT at the time. Today we use LBGTQ, and I'm sorry, there may have actually be another letter in there, another term in there. I don't know if this was even used back then, but we do believe the Stonewall catered to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. The police raid it. They're, of course, again, technically what they're doing if they're engaged in any type of sexual relations, is illegal. In New York, it was illegal to engage in homosexual relations. So the police use this as their justification to attack and raid the place, believing they're treating it as a house of ill repute. Basically, they're treating it almost as like a illegal establishment, an illegal speakeasy, really. They rioted for 2 days. The bar is burned down, fighting in the streets with police. It was bad. Now the gay community fought back. Police were injured, people were hurt. Now you cannot justify necessarily some of that. Some of the violence was certainly instigated by the bar patrons. Some of it was. It got bad. It lasted close to 2 days. Lots of violence, but it does bring the issue to national attention. It really does. It does bring the issue to national attention. It brings it to the mainstream press, and it really galvanizes the movement. It makes people in the movement even more willing and able to take risks and to really challenge the status quo, believing they should have the right to come out. They should have the right to express their sexuality openly. They shouldn't be treated as criminals or villains or to be attacked by the police. They should have the right to be equally treated Americans with all the rights and responsibilities thereof, regardless of their sexual orientation. We see a national gay task force. 1975 is formed. National Gay Task Force. It lobbied Congress. It sued in courts and tries to get changes made. It's really slow to come about, but we do today know that almost all states have abolished their anti-gay laws. However, they have not all. There are a handful of states in the U.S., primarily in the Southeast, the Deep South, which make still sexual relations, um, for instance, sodomy. Sodomy is still illegal in many southern states. Anal sex, although technically sodomy applies to oral sex as well. It's not. It's just. I think it applies to oral sex as well. Nonetheless, I mean, how can you enforce this stuff? You can't really enforce it. Nonetheless, it has gotten much better in America, much better than it used to be. There is still a stigma associated with being LGBTQ. There still is. We know this. But if you consider how bad it was for your parents, your grandparents' generation, where they couldn't even come out, and if they did, they would have their entire lives destroyed. It's actually come a long ways. It's really come a long ways in the last 50 years. LGBTQ opportunities and rights and treatment and acceptance. It's really come leaps and bounds just in the last 50 years, truthfully. And it really starts here in the 70s. We see a real push here in the 70s for this movement to where simply they need to be able to come out and say who they are and shouldn't have to hide it, shouldn't be ashamed of it. All right, Nixon's war in Vietnam. Yeah. All right. He claimed he represented the silent majority of Americans. Yeah, he probably did. He probably did in some way. The conservative middle ground, middle class whites against the radical left wing Democrats. That's who he claimed to represent. The conservative middle class whites versus the radical left wing Democrats. That is a far oversimplification. But even though he barely won the election, he does fulfill his promises to eventually get us out of the war, which makes him quite popular. The overriding focus of his first 4 years in office was the war, dealing with the war, which was probably the most important issue on most Americans' minds, was the war. He says he's going to achieve peace with honor. Okay. He's going to achieve peace with honor because we couldn't honorably leave Vietnam without it being free of communism. So his attempt is to find peace with honor, freeing Vietnam from communism, peacefully and achieving peace by honor. Yeah, it's a propaganda thing. His program is known as Vietnamization. It does have some good positive effects, even though it's all just a bunch of smokescreen, really. It's really, he knows, we already know this for a fact, that he knows he can't win. There is no other option here than to frankly get out. He knows this has to happen, but he wants to find a way to get out while also making himself and America still look good. We do see, again, some positive stuff. We see a decrease in the number of troops, which does make many people happy. So we see what we call a drawdown. We see the number of troops decreasing, which, of course, that also means the number of casualties decrease. The number of injuries also decrease. We start to shift responsibility for fighting to the South Vietnamese. We start having the South Vietnamese do all the fighting. We've been there for years training them. We, in essence, say it's your turn to step up and protect your own country. They had always, but the majority of the fighting had been done by Americans. Now we're starting to shift the majority to the Vietnamese. Troop numbers decrease over the next 5 years. Our casualties decrease while the actual number of Vietnam deaths increase. The actual number of deaths of Vietnamese increase. So more Vietnamese people are dying while fewer Americans are dying. So the actual war gets worse. The anti-war movement increases as well because we continue bombing. Nixon still wants to, as we're starting to leave, he wants to still hurt North Vietnam. He wants to still chase the communists out if possible. He didn't learn from LBJ that it was impossible to do this. So we see increases in bombing campaigns, which kill tens of hundreds of thousands of civilians. Then we actually bomb Cambodia, which is a neutral nearby country. It's a neutral country that borders Vietnam. Wasn't involved in the war. We start bombing Cambodia. Why do we start bombing Cambodia? Because we believe the North Vietnamese are hiding in Cambodia. They were. They were hiding in Cambodia. So we believe they're hiding in Cambodia, so we start bombing Cambodia, which is a neutral country. That was an act of war right there. But our argument is simple. Well, you're basically you're helping the enemy, so you're also an enemy, even though we don't ever officially declare anything against Cambodia. Then we do invade Cambodia in 1970, again, not official. And the invasion of Cambodia is to basically follow the Tet offensive path, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Invade Cambodia to go to North Vietnam to attack North Vietnam, or even simply push the North Vietnamese Viet Cong out of Cambodia. Either way. We see massive protests. We see student deaths in America. It's ugly. It's bad. This gets worse. Student protests, student deaths. We see shootings on college campuses. These are the famous, have you ever heard of the Kent State shootings? These are the famous shootings where the military actually shoot and kill students. The Ohio National Guard fires into an anti-war rally, Kent State, kills 4 students. Mississippi, 2 black students are killed in an anti-war rally. This shit's getting real. We now have Americans shooting and killing other Americans at home over the war protests, over what Americans are doing in Vietnam, around the world. 1969, we learned of the My Lai Massacre. My Lai Massacre, which happened in 68, where 500 South Vietnamese, by the way, that's our allies. That's the ones we are there to protect, the ones that we're there to help, the ones that we are fighting the war for is the South Vietnamese, our friends. This is a fact that happened. This is released. This is not conjecture. This has happened. The U.S. military admits to it. The U.S. Army admits to it finally, at one point. We see over 500 South Vietnamese men, women, and children killed, executed, burned alive. And we see dozens of women gang raped by U.S. Army soldiers. Pictures come out about this. It is unbelievable. It is the atrocities of war. It is, yeah, it's hard to even understand. Let me actually put this in perspective. This happens in every war. It happens in every war. It happened in the American Civil War, happened in Korea, happened in Vietnam. It happens in pretty much every extended conflict. It just doesn't usually get so much public attention. But this is the nature of war. War is terrible. War is violent. War is destructive. And innocence. Anyway. Americans start calling American soldiers baby killers. Uh, this becomes a term you start seeing tossed around by especially anti-war protesters. Soldiers are baby killers. Only one person was actually convicted. The platoon leader was actually blamed for the whole thing. He was convicted of 22 murders and sentenced to life in prison. One man, even though it was actually committed by an entire platoon did this. It was bad. Dozens of soldiers were involved in this. Convicted, sentenced to life in prison, 22 murders, and Nixon commuted his sentence. Pardoned him after 3 years. Sent him to home on house arrest. Nixon was criticized for this for the rest of his life. Literally the rest of his life. People wrote about this and talked about this. That all of this happened and only one person got in trouble, and that one person was given a free ticket, excusing him for it. Now I'm sure his life was never the same, but you know what? He shouldn't have allowed this to happen either. So where can you go from there? American image is forever damaged and aged. You better believe it. Uh, Forever damaged. What we did here in Vietnam. Peace with honor, huh? The irony of this, I suppose, is we don't achieve peace in Vietnam, and we do not. It is not honorable for the U.S. It really isn't. What ends up happening. Now, the blame should not be laid upon the soldiers in general. It should not, of course, be blamed on them. This group that did this in My Lai, that was a very small little group. But generally speaking, as far as the government goes, you can blame the government for this conflict because LBJ never should have done this. Nixon should not have continued this. It just needed to end. It never should have happened in the first place. Unfortunately, it did. So, what can you do? Uh, you can't excuse it. You simply have to accept that it happened. Finally, we come to Nixon's plans to get out of Vietnam. He uses two strategies to really find this peace with honor, which we don't really achieve either. First, Nixon did seek these better relations with the Soviet Union and China. This became known as detente, which is this lessening of tensions between East and West. He signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty we call SALT, SALT 1. SALT 1. This is a limitation of the arms race. And the beginning, we actually talk about this as maybe the ending in Vietnam, ending of the Vietnam War and the signing of SALT actually starts the end of the Cold War. It's just a little bitty bit. But this actually begins, this is the beginning of the ending of the Cold War with SALT. Um, and the end of the war in Vietnam, as we're about to talk about. This lessening of tensions and a step toward ending the arms race and ending the Cold War. Nixon then travels to China. Hugely significant. First president to do it. First president to travel to China, which is considered our enemy. It's considered our enemy in the world. He travels to China in 72. He visits the nation. He wants to befriend the Chinese and the Russians. He wants to actually get their assistance so he can get out of Vietnam. Again, trying to achieve peace with honor. Some of the stuff Nixon did here is commendable. It is. He does actually bring a lessening of tensions between East and West by ending the war and eventually getting out of it. Some of this is commendable, what does happen here between Nixon and what he achieves with Russia and the Soviets. We do see a reduction in arms capacity. We do see a reduction. We do see the beginning of a nuclear limitations where we actually start reducing the amount of nuclear stockpile. We actually start to put a halt on it. Um, this actually extends further under Reagan. So we do see some of this. We do. He tries to find a graceful way out of the war. And the second part of the strategy is what we call exit America. Pretty clear. The second part of ending the war in Vietnam. 1972, the U.S. starts another massive bombing campaign. What the F? Really? Another one? We start our third massive bombing campaign. B-52 bombings of North Vietnam. We want the North Vietnamese to surrender. Have we learned nothing? Have we learned nothing? They're more resolute, they're more resolved now. I mean, by 72, we've taken most of our troops out. It's literally South Vietnam versus North Vietnam now. Do they really think they're going to surrender now? We're leaving. We're bailing. We're down to like 100,000 troops. We're walking out the door, and now you're going to think we think they're going to surrender? I've never understood. I've read books about this. I've never understood the mentality of this. It doesn't make sense. It's ridiculous. It's like playing a football game and giving up and walking off the field and then afterwards saying, we won, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Yeah. Anyway, it doesn't work. Supplies keep coming in. The North Vietnamese are resolute. Peace talks do start. We do start these Paris peace talks. Paris peace negotiations do begin. That would be a wrong way to say it. Negotiations have been going on all along. There had always been different negotiations going on, all the way back to the 40s. Remember, this really started back in 1945. There'd always been negotiations. We do finally get a negotiation to where America will officially withdraw. We will withdraw from Vietnam. South Vietnam asked us to stay. South Vietnam begged us to stay. They begged us to stay because they knew it wasn't going to be good. Our entire purpose was to protect South Vietnamese from the North Vietnamese Viet Cong communists. We have now decided it is the best interest of America to walk away. We've lost. Even though we never admit we lost, because first of all, there was no war ever declared. We never declared war. So there was nothing ever to technically win or lose. Technically, even though obviously we lost this. This was a disaster. 73, a peace treaty is signed. We do get a peace treaty signed. We removed the last of our troops in 73. However, the war does continue. The Vietnam War continues. I mean, that's the real war. The actual real official war is between North and South Vietnam. That's the real one. We were there just to keep the peace, which we did not do. The war continues between South Vietnam. We eventually cut off all of our support by 74. We stopped giving money. We started giving supplies. We stopped doing advisors. In 1975, Saigon is captured. Saigon falls. That's the capital of South Vietnam. And we get what's created a united communist Vietnam. U.S. casualties. Almost 500,000 injured. 60,000 dead. That's American soldiers. 60,000 American soldiers dead, almost 500,000 wounded. We do not have an accurate number of how many Vietnamese were killed, but most numbers put in the 3 to 5 million Vietnamese and Cambodians. Remember, the last couple years of the war, the whole war spilled over into Cambodia, even though they were technically neutral. They really weren't. They had allowed their country to be overrun by the North Vietnamese for years, so they really weren't neutral. But between Cambodians and Vietnamese, North and South, we're talking millions dead during and after the war. 60,000 Americans, almost 500,000 Americans injured. The cost to the U.S. $150 billion. Largest expenditure ever. Way more than we expended in World War II. $150 billion. We were involved in Vietnam for 30 years, from 45 to 75. The overall result, nothing changed. Literally, had we not ever got involved in Vietnam, it would have become communist. All the loss of life, all the death, all the misery, all the tragedy. Of course, now hindsight's 2020. We have no way of knowing this. We'd be telling a different story had we gone into Vietnam and won, right? We'd gone into Vietnam and we'd won. We'd saved Vietnam. We'd made it into a democratic republic. Shit, we'd be telling a different story, wouldn't we? Yeah, we would. It's reality. It's true. You know. Well, this is the story we're telling. Millions dead, billions in losses and economic losses, tore our country apart, along with lots of other things. And ultimately, the result was nothing, no change, no difference, nothing happened. It destroys our image. All those people lost, all the soldiers, all the loss of infrastructure. It destroys our image around the globe, especially in Asia. It's pretty insane, really. But again, we're talking about it from hindsight. We're looking back on it and being like, "Oh, you screwed up all this. You did all this. This was wrong. This was terrible. Blah 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 blah." I'm pragmatic. I understand the reality. If we had won, we'd be saying a different story. We would. So I mean, it happened. Were there mistakes made? Obviously. Were lies told? Obviously. Did so many people die? Obviously. But it happened. Nothing's going to change that. 1972, the election. The Democratic Party fell apart. Don't get me wrong, it isn't like they collapsed or anything, but they were in disarray, disunion. They fell apart. They lose offices across the country. They obviously lost the presidency. Everything that happened here from 68 to 72 was good for the Republican Party. Politically speaking. Politically speaking, it was really good for them. It increased their image, it increased their authority. It really showed that they were on the right side of this. The Democrats got us in, the Republicans brought us out of the war. So it shows that in every way, the Republicans are on the right side of history in this. The actual details are far more complicated than that, but certainly publicly, obviously, more, at least to the general public, that's the way it looks. So this was really good for him. We see women, blacks, and a lot of younger delegates really. The convention changes. The convention really shifts to the constituency of minorities and liberals. The Democratic Party, which doesn't really represent the majority of Americans. Minorities represent 15% of the population in this time period. Liberals represent probably a comparable amount, 15-20% of their population, as far as really liberal. So this becomes the movement towards the Democratic parties for the future. But for the next 20 years or so, the Democrats really lose a lot of authority. I mean, yes, we get damn, why do I keep forgetting his name? We get the peanut farmer, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter. We get him in the 70s, but he was an aberration, really. It was sort of odd him getting elected in this Jimmy Carter, which we won't actually really be able to spend a lot of time on, or we won't spend any time on Carter, unfortunately, because he's an interesting cat. He was a bad president. He wasn't a good president, frankly. But we won't really get time to talk about that. Gives a very poor showing in 1972. Really has to rebuild itself. They choose George McGovern. He was the sacrificial lamb. Democrats knew they couldn't win the election against Nixon. His popularity was through the freaking roof. He got us out of Vietnam. After almost a decade of violence and destruction and chaos, he was the savior of America. Yep. So they knew anyone they threw up against Nixon was going to get creamed, and he did. McGovern gets smashed. He was liberal, anti-war, pro-women. He was a poor campaigner. He didn't have the style of Nixon. He was liberal when liberals were now the bad guys, because liberals were responsible for the blood in the streets, the war, the violence, the chaos. It was all blamed on liberals and the Democrats. Nixon, of course, represents the silent majority. He wins the election resoundingly. He only loses 2 states. So McGovern wins only 2 states. Nixon wins 48. I believe we have 48 states in this time period. Yeah. Wow. Slam right in the basket, baby. Yeah. Actually, he wins 49 states because he loses Massachusetts in the District of Columbia, which is not a state. So he wins, McGovern wins DC and Massachusetts. That's it. So it means Nixon won 49 states. Jeez. Uh, yeah, I think. I think it's actually the most resounding victory since George Washington, as far as winning all the states. Pretty crazy, isn't it? John Hospers. Hell, I don't even know. Don't even ask me. George McGovern. He gets a lot of votes. I mean, he gets 30 million people voting for him, which is great. But, yeah, 17 electoral votes. DC, that's the three, and then 14 is Massachusetts. So that's his 17 votes right there. 520. Isn't that crazy? It is. The most resounding victory ever, other than George Washington himself. Oh, the three here, that's DC. Here's your three. I don't believe any other presidents had this much of a major landslide victory. Uh, yeah. All right. Watergate and the fall of a president. This is where we end in this long. You're like, oh my God, we're still going. Isn't it over? This is the last part of it. Watergate. You gotta talk about Watergate. You mean you got to. Watergate is just, it's just interesting. Nixon had utter dominance. He pretty much takes the entire country, wins in a landslide victory. What was the percentage? 60%. 60% win. That's largely due to his victory in Vietnam, getting us out of Vietnam, and of course the drawdown of Vietnam. Weren't totally out, but the drawdown of Vietnam, and then of course uh, the disarray of the Democrats, of course. In June of 1972, there was a break-in in the Watergate hotel complex. It was more than just a hotel, but it was a big complex. It was like offices, hotels, everything. So in June of 72, there was a break-in at the Watergate complex in Washington. Now, the Watergate complex was the home of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee. Basically, the leaders of the Democratic Party, the ones who are all the administrative leaders, the ones who decide who runs for president. Why did this group break into the DNC? Because they wanted to get information. They wanted to get information about the Democratic Party to find out who Nixon was going to be running against in 72. They were spies working for Nixon. Um, they were caught. Boom, caught. Two of the five guilty were from Creep. Creep? What the hell were they thinking when they created this? I don't know, but yeah, that was the name of it. The committee to re-elect the president. They worked for. It was a separate committee. I guess it was a private committee that was actually there to re-elect Nixon. Two of the five parties were from Creep. They had wiretapping devices. They were going to tap the phones of the DNC to spy on the Democrats for the upcoming election, to help the Republicans and to help Nixon win the election. They were a secret group that were known privately among the Republican Party as the Plumbers. This was primarily Nixon's group. It was. Nixon knew about it. But at the same time, many other people in the Republicans knew about it. Many people in the Republican Party knew about it. They just didn't openly speak about it. They were sort of this secret group, which was to spy and get information on their opponents. Yeah, they were doing this. They were to plug leaks. They were to protect the president through non-legal methods. In essence, they were there to protect Nixon and through bribes, threats, and coercion, and then also to protect the Republican Party, the White House, and to attack the Democrats. To sabotage the Democratic Party if at all possible. Now, instead of going to trial, Nixon actually arranges hush money. All this is happening in 62. He arranges hush money. He instructs the CIA to stop the investigation, to stop the FBI investigation. Oh yeah, crazy stuff. getting the CIA, the FBI, White House, people in Congress. He gets all kinds of people involved in this, all to shut the thing down, to hide it, to sweep it under the rug, to hide it all. Well, he does this for the better part of a year. He gets reelected. Boom! Big win. Big win. Big landslide win. Well, the following year, in 73, the Washington Post investigative reporters, see if I have their names in here. Oh, I don't have their names. You can look this up. You may even know who they are. They find out about it. They start interviewing people. They start getting documents. And the Washington Post breaks this open as probably the greatest news story of all time up to this point. They reveal it all. The entire break-in, the cover-ups, the reports, the collusion among different government officials, the CIA, the FBI. They reveal it all. And they get it all out there. Um, if you really want to know the best story, there's a movie called All the President's Men from the 70s. Great movie, and it's very factual, and it really tells the story of how this happened and how these guys were threatened. I mean, they received death threats, they were stalked, they were harassed, they feared for their lives. These reporters did. This leads a trail to the White House, and every single time, every new person is revealed as this whole line, this whole chain goes all the way back to Nixon. It reveals that this is a massive cover up, probably the largest cover up ever up to this point in American history, in the White House, at least that we've ever been aware of. Um, Eventually, it all points to the president, and then a secret Oval Office taping system is discovered to where Nixon was actually recording all of his conversations in there, in the Oval Office. He recorded everyone. The whole purpose of him using recordings was for blackmail, because no one knew about it. So he could blackmail people by using their private recordings. The implications of this, all of it points to him. The Oval Office, by the way, you can listen to these recordings online. You can find them online. The House decides to impeach him. The House of Representatives starts articles of impeachment to actually remove the president from office for this. They start considering articles of impeachment once the tapes come out which prove all of his guilt. It's literally right there in his recordings. They get the recordings. They're subpoenaed. Supreme Court gets involved, and the recordings come out. And it says right there in Nixon's own words all of his illegal machinations, all of his illegal stuff he did. It proves he's guilt. It proves he will be impeached. We've never had a president impeached. Um, no, I say that wrong. I apologize. I think we have we've had two presidents impeached. Sorry, we've had two presidents impeached. As of now, technically, I guess three. We've actually had three. We've never had a president removed from office, even though we have had three impeached. Many people don't understand impeachment. Impeachment is not removal from office. Impeachment is basically just a slap on the wrist that says you did something wrong. That's all it is. Removal from office is a whole nother process. So impeachment is just one thing. That says you did something wrong. That is a high crime. But then removing from office is a whole nother thing. So we've had three presidents impeached. But no one's removed from office. Nixon would have probably been removed from office. We don't know, probably. But before being impeached, he resigns. He simply walks away, believing he will be impeached and removed from office. Probably. His vice president takes over, Gerald Ford, immediately pardons Nixon. Immediately pardons him. What an asshole. Immediately pardons Nixon. First president, only president to ever resign. I don't believe we've ever had, yeah, this is the only president to ever resign from office. Congress passes a whole series of laws to control presidential power. War Powers Act of 73, which limits the president's power to declare war, which was totally unnecessary because the Constitution already says the only body which can declare war is Congress. So why do we even need that? But nonetheless, it limits the power of the president. Also, we get the Freedom of Information Act, 1974, which has been used many, many times since, which really allows the public to access government records, government documents, and all with the purpose of restricting presidential powers. I'm not so sure it was successful. I think we could argue today the most powerful branch of the US government is the executive branch, the presidential office. And the executive branch is huge. It includes way more than the president. Think about Washington and think about offices in Washington and power of Washington. And almost anything you can think of that is not actually part of Congress is really executive. The executive branch is the most powerful branch of government, you could argue. I would argue it is, even though it never was meant to be. So the War Powers Act to restrict the president's powers to declare war and other things, and of course freedom of information to get all the different documents out there, to try and make more, the term we use is transparency, to make the government more transparent. Really changes how government runs as a result of Nixon's actions. All right. Thanks for going through this with me. I appreciate it. This is a really interesting, very informative chapter, and a lot of it really influences our modern politics today. It really does. We will call it quits right there, and thanks.